Sometimes the most powerful bonds are forged in silence between a man and a wounded animal who both needed healing. In a Pennsylvania courthouse, 61-year-old Amish farmer Eli Zook is about to do something that will leave everyone in tears. He's here to testify about a German shepherd named Valor, who showed up bleeding at his farm months ago. Eli didn't know this dog was a decorated police officer who went missing during a tragic raid. He just knew a broken creature needed help. For weeks, they sat together in quiet companionship while the dog healed. Now Valor is back on the force, but something has changed in him. His handler wants him retired, calling him unfit for duty. When Eli is called to speak, he doesn't address the judge or lawyers. Instead, he turns to the dog and begins talking softly, the way he did during those peaceful mornings on the farm. What happens next will show everyone in that courtroom the true meaning of healing and faith. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Lancaster County like a prayer whispered over the land. Eli Zook stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun paint the fields in shades of gold and amber. At 61, his hands bore the honest calluses of 4 decades spent working this soil, and his beard had grown silver with the wisdom that comes from a life lived simply and with purpose. The farmhouse around him held the quiet dignity of generations. His grandfather had built these walls with his own hands in 1924, and the worn wooden floors still creaked in the same familiar places where 3 generations of Zooks had walked. The kitchen table, scarred by countless meals and family gatherings, sat empty now, except for his morning coffee and the worn leather Bible that had belonged to his father. 2 years had passed since Martha's funeral, yet Eli still set 2 cups on the counter each morning before remembering. The habit of love, he'd learned, dies harder than love itself. She had been his companion for 37 years, sharing everything from the bitter cold of January barn chores to the sweet satisfaction of watching their corn grow tall in July heat. Now the farmhouse felt too large, too quiet, filled with echoes of conversations that would never come again. But grief, Eli had discovered, was like the seasons. It had its own rhythm, its own purpose in the grand design. Martha would have scolded him for wallowing, would have reminded him that the Lord's work didn't pause for sorrow. So each morning he rose at 5, read from Psalms, and tended to the animals that depended on him. His routine had become his anchor. In a world that suddenly seemed unmoored, the farm itself was modest by modern standards. 40 acres of good Pennsylvania soil that grew corn and hay, a small dairy operation with 12 Holstein cows, and a vegetable garden that Martha had loved and that he now maintained as a living memory of her gentle hands. The red barn, weathered but sturdy, housed his equipment and served as shelter for the handful of chickens and the old draft horse, Benjamin, who had earned his retirement but still enjoyed the occasional ride to town. Eli's days followed a pattern, as reliable as sunrise. Morning milking at 6, breakfast alone with his Bible, then the endless cycle of farm work that varied with the seasons but never truly ended. In spring, there was planting and the birth of calves. Summer brought haying, and the constant maintenance that kept a small operation running. Fall meant harvest and preparation for winter's harsh demands. And winter was for repair, for planning, for the kind of deep thinking that only comes when the earth lies dormant beneath snow. The Amish community of Peaceful Valley had wrapped around him like a quilt after Martha's passing. His neighbor, Samuel Byler, a man of few words but generous spirit, often appeared at sunrise to help with the heavier chores. The women of the church brought casseroles and silent comfort, understanding that some griefs were too deep for words. Yet Eli knew that his solitude worried them. At 61, he was still young enough for a second chance at companionship, but his heart felt too worn for such considerations. It was a Tuesday morning in late March when his orderly world shifted. On its axis, The last patches of snow clung stubbornly to the north side of the barn, and the air carried that particular chill that promised winter wasn't quite finished with Pennsylvania. Eli had just finished the morning milking and was walking back to the house when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in his peaceful valley. It was a whimper, low and desperate, coming from somewhere near the old oak tree that marked the boundary between his land and the county road. At first, he thought it might be a coyote, injured perhaps, and his practical mind began calculating the safest way to handle such a situation. But as he drew closer, his heart recognized what his eyes confirmed. This was no wild animal. The German shepherd lay beneath the spreading branches of the oak, and even from a distance, Eli could see the dark stains on its coat that meant blood. The dog's eyes, intelligent brown eyes that seemed too old for the face that held them, tracked his approach with a mixture of hope and terror. There was no collar, no identification, just a magnificent animal reduced to pain and fear and the kind of desperate trust that reaches out to any kind soul willing to help. Eli had always possessed an uncommon gift with animals. Martha used to tease him that he spoke their language better than he spoke English, and it was true that creatures of all kinds seemed to sense his gentle spirit. Now, approaching this wounded stranger, he found himself falling into the old rhythms of comfort that had served him well over the years. "Easy now, friend," he murmured, his voice carrying the same tone he used with spooked cattle or injured barn cats. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The dog's ears flicked forward at his words, and Eli saw the moment when fear gave way to a tentative hope. This was an animal accustomed to human companionship, he realized. The way it responded to his voice spoke of training and trust that had been shattered by whatever had brought it to his land. The injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. Deep cuts along the right shoulder, what looked like bite marks on the left rear leg, and an overall condition that suggested the animal had been surviving on its own for some time. But it was the look in those brown eyes that caught Eli's attention, a depth of trauma that he recognized from his own mirror in the months after Martha's death. Moving with the patience that comes from a lifetime of working with frightened animals, Eli managed to coax the dog close enough to examine the wounds properly. The animal was male, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with the powerful build of a working dog. His coat, beneath the mud and blood, was the rich black and tan of a well-bred German shepherd, and his bearing suggested nobility even in his weakened state. "What happened to you, boy?" Eli asked softly, his weathered hands gentle as he assessed the damage. "What brought you to my corner of the world?" The dog's only response was to press closer to Eli's warmth, as if seeking not just physical comfort, but the kind of soul-deep healing that comes from being truly seen and accepted. In that moment, sitting beneath the old oak tree with a wounded stranger pressed against his knees, Eli felt something shift in his chest, a stirring of purpose that had been dormant since Martha's passing. He couldn't know, as he carried the injured animal toward his barn, that this chance encounter would soon draw him into a world far removed from his simple farming life. He couldn't foresee the courtrooms and legal battles, the media attention and difficult choices that lay ahead. All he knew was that Providence had brought a broken creature to his land, and his faith demanded that he respond with the same compassion that had sustained his people for generations. The dog, he would come to think of him simply as friend, in those first days, accepted Eli's ministrations with the dignity of an old soul, recognizing a kindred spirit. As Eli cleaned the wounds and applied the simple remedies he'd learned from years of veterinary necessity on the farm, he found himself talking to the animal as naturally as he'd once talked to Martha while she worked in her garden. "You've seen some troubles, haven't you?" he murmured as he worked. "Well, this old farm's seen its share too. Maybe we can help each other remember what peace looks like." The German shepherd's tail gave a single tentative wag, the first sign of hope Eli had seen in those intelligent brown eyes. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it carried the weight of possibility. Neither man nor animal could have imagined, in that quiet moment in the barn, how profoundly their lives were about to change, or how their bond would soon become the center of a story that would touch the hearts of everyone who heard it. Outside, the Pennsylvania morning continued its ancient rhythm, unaware that a simple act of compassion was about to ripple outward in ways that would challenge everything. A small community thought it knew about healing, justice, and the mysterious ways that broken souls sometimes find each other in a world that often seems too harsh for tenderness. 2 months had passed since the German Shepherd had arrived at Eli's farm, and in that time both man and animal had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The dog's wounds had healed cleanly under Eli's patient care, and his coat had regained its lustrous shine. More importantly, the haunted look in those brown eyes had softened into something approaching contentment. Eli had named him Friend, though he suspected the animal had answered to something else in his previous life. Friend seemed to accept the new identity readily enough, responding to his name with the dignity of a creature who understood that sometimes starting over required leaving the past behind. Their days together had taken on a comfortable pattern. Friend would accompany Eli on his morning rounds, walking at heel without any formal training, as if his previous life had taught him the value of staying close to someone who offered safety. During the long afternoons, while Eli worked in the fields or tended to equipment in the barn, Friend would find a spot where he could keep watch over the entire farm, alert but peaceful, like a guardian who had finally found something worth protecting. The transformation was remarkable. The wounded, terrified animal who had collapsed beneath the oak tree had given way to a confident, gentle companion who seemed to understand Eli's moods and needs without explanation. When grief would overtake, the older man, usually in the evenings when Martha's absence felt most acute, Friend would appear at his side, offering the kind of wordless comfort that transcends species. But on this particular morning in late May, as spring painted the Pennsylvania countryside in shades of green that would have made Martha smile, their peaceful world was about to face its first real test. Eli was repairing a section of fence near the road when he heard the vehicles approaching. 2 Pennsylvania State Police cruisers turned into his drive, their presence as jarring as thunder on a clear day. Friend, who had been dozing in a patch of sunlight, immediately came alert, his posture shifting from relaxed companion to something far more watchful. The first officer to emerge was a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of competent bearing that spoke of years in law enforcement. Her partner was older, a heavy-set man whose weathered face suggested he'd seen enough of the world's troubles to approach each new situation with appropriate caution. But it was the way Friend reacted to their presence that caught Eli's attention, not with fear exactly, but with a complex mixture of recognition and wariness that suggested these uniforms meant something significant in his past. "Mr. Zook?" The female officer approached with her hands visible, clearly aware of how her presence might appear to a member of the Amish community. "I'm Officer Sarah Chen, Pennsylvania State Police. This is Detective Mike Rodriguez. We were hoping to speak with you about a dog." Eli set down his hammer, his mind immediately racing to Friend, who had moved to stand beside him in a gesture that was both protective and seeking protection. "What kind of business would the state police have with my dog, Officer Chen?" Detective Rodriguez stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. As he unfolded it, Eli could see it was some kind of official poster or flyer. The detective's expression was serious, but not unkind, as he held it up for Eli to see. "Mr. Zook, we believe this might be your dog." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Eli looked at the poster. The photograph was unmistakably Friend, the same intelligent brown eyes, the same noble bearing, the same distinctive markings. But the text beneath the image told a story that shattered everything Eli thought he knew about his quiet companion. "Missing, K-9 Officer Valor, Pennsylvania State Police. Last seen during drug enforcement operation. Presumed dead. Any information? Contact. Eli's hands shook slightly as he took the poster, reading the details that painted friend in an entirely different light. 5 years of service, decorated for valor in the line of duty, partner to Detective James Murphy. The dates lined up perfectly with friend's arrival at the farm. Valor, Eli said quietly, and the dog's ears immediately perked up at what was clearly his real name. The reaction was unmistakable. This wasn't friend, wasn't the peaceful farm companion who had shared his quiet mornings. This was Valor, a police officer with a history and a duty that extended far beyond the boundaries of Eli's small world. Officer Chen's expression softened as she watched the interaction. Mr. Zook, Valor has been missing for almost 3 months. He disappeared during a drug raid that went very badly. His partner, Detective Murphy, was killed in the operation, and we lost track of Valor in the chaos that followed. The department has been searching for him ever since. The weight of this revelation settled on Eli like a heavy blanket. Detective Rodriguez continued, his voice gentle but professional. Valor was more than just a working dog, Mr. Zook. He and Detective Murphy had been partners for 5 years. They'd worked some of the most dangerous cases in the state, taken down major drug operations, saved countless lives. When we lost them both that night, the entire department mourned. Eli looked down at the dog, at Valor, who seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The animal's expression was complex, showing recognition of his real name and these uniforms, but also a clear preference for remaining at Eli's side. What happened that night? Eli asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Officer Chen and Detective Rodriguez exchanged glances before Chen spoke. There was intelligence about a major distribution operation working out of an abandoned warehouse in Harrisburg. Murphy and Valor were part of a coordinated raid involving multiple units, but the intelligence was compromised. The dealers were waiting for us. Rodriguez's voice grew heavy with memory. Murphy was shot trying to secure the building. Valor was with him when it happened. In the confusion and gunfire that followed, the dog just disappeared. We searched for weeks, had volunteers combing the countryside, checked every shelter and veterinary clinic in 3 counties. Eventually, we had to assume he'd been killed too, either in the firefight or afterward. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the trees and the distant lowing of cattle. Eli found himself looking at Valor, friend, with new eyes, seeing not just the gentle companion who had shared his grief and healing, but a professional who had witnessed horrors and lost someone he loved just as profoundly as Eli had lost Martha. He was hurt when he came to me, Eli said finally, wounded, traumatized. I thought he'd been hit by a car or attacked by wild animals. But if what you're saying is true, he probably traveled over 60 miles to reach your farm, Chen said. Injured, grieving, looking for some place safe to heal? You saved his life, Mr. Zook. Detective Rodriguez stepped closer, his expression sympathetic but determined. Which brings us to why we're here. Now that we've found him, the department needs to evaluate Valor's condition. He's a valuable asset, trained at considerable expense, and there are procedures we need to follow. Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of procedures? He'll need to be examined by veterinary specialists, undergo psychological evaluation, determine if he's fit to return to active duty, Chen explained. The department has invested years in his training, and if he's physically and mentally sound, he could return to service with a new partner. The word new hung in the air like a judgment. Eli understood, perhaps better than these officers realized, what it meant to be asked to start over after losing someone irreplaceable. He looked down at Valor, who had moved closer to his legs, as if sensing the threat to their peaceful existence together. And if he's not fit for duty? Eli asked. The pause before Rodriguez answered told Eli more than he wanted to know. There are protocols for that situation too, Mr. Zook. The department can't maintain animals who can't perform their function. The implications were clear, even if unspoken. Eli's mind raced through the possibilities, none of them including the quiet continuation of their life together on the farm. Valor, friend, had found peace here, had healed not just physically but emotionally. To tear him away now seemed like a second trauma, a betrayal of the trust that had developed between them. When? Eli asked simply. We were hoping to take him with us today, Chen said, though her tone suggested she understood the difficulty of what she was asking. The sooner we can complete the evaluation, the sooner we can determine his future. Eli looked down at Valor, whose brown eyes met his with complete trust. In that gaze, he saw not just a police dog waiting for orders, but a friend who had chosen to stay, who had found in their quiet mornings together something worth holding on to. Could I ask for one night? Eli said finally. To say goodbye properly? The Sioux officers exchanged glances, and Chen nodded slowly. We can return tomorrow morning, Mr. Zook, but we will need to take him then. As the police cruisers pulled away, Eli remained standing by the fence, the missing dog poster still clutched in his weathered hands. Valor pressed against his legs, and for the first time since the dog's arrival, both man and animal seemed to understand that their time together was not infinite, that the world beyond the farm had claims that might prove stronger than the bonds they had forged in silence and healing. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset over the Pennsylvania hills, Eli found himself memorizing the weight of Valor's head against his knee, the rhythm of the dog's breathing, the peace that had defined their months together. Tomorrow would bring changes that neither of them could control, but tonight still belonged to them. Two souls who had found each other in their darkest hours and discovered that healing was possible, even when the future remained uncertain. The night passed with the weight of finality that comes before unwanted change. Eli found himself unable to sleep, instead sitting in his kitchen chair watching Valor rest by the fireplace. The dog seemed to sense the heaviness in the air, occasionally lifting his head to meet Eli's gaze with eyes that held depths of understanding that transcended words. As dawn broke over Lancaster County, painting the sky in soft pastels that Martha had always loved, Eli prepared for what felt like another goodbye. He had buried his parents, his wife, watched friends pass into memory, but somehow this parting felt different, unfinished, like a conversation interrupted at its most important moment. When the state police vehicles returned, Officer Chen emerged. At first, her expression more gentle than official. Behind her, Detective Rodriguez carried what appeared to be a leather leash and collar, equipment that spoke of Valor's return to a world Eli barely understood. Mr. Zook, Chen said softly, I want you to know that whatever happens, the department is grateful for what you've done. You saved Valor's life, and that means something to all of us. Valor moved to Eli's side as the officers approached, his posture alert but not aggressive. It struck Eli how the dog seemed to exist in two worlds simultaneously, the peaceful farm companion who had learned to trust again, and the trained professional who recognized the authority these uniforms represented. Before we go, Rodriguez said, I think you should know more about what Valor meant to Detective Murphy and what Murphy meant to the department. He pulled out his phone and showed Eli a photograph. Two figures in police uniform, a man with kind eyes and a patient smile, kneeling beside a younger, more vibrant version of Valor. The bond between them was evident even in a still image, the kind of partnership that develops between souls who trust each other completely. James Murphy was one of our best, Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss. 15 years on the force, commendations for bravery, a reputation for fairness that earned respect even from the criminals he arrested. But it was his work with Valor that really defined him as an officer. Chen took up the story, her professional composure softening as she spoke. They were paired 5 years ago, when Valor was just 2 years old. Murphy had requested a K9 partner after his previous partner retired, and the match was perfect from the beginning. Valor was intelligent, loyal, fearless when necessary, but never aggressive without cause. They worked some of the most dangerous cases in the state, Rodriguez added. Drug operations, missing persons, search and rescue. There were times when Valor's nose and instinct saved lives that would have been lost without him. Murphy used to joke that his partner was smarter than most of the humans he worked with. As the officers spoke, Eli watched Valor's reactions carefully. The dog's ears were forward, attentive, and there was something in his expression that suggested recognition, not just of the uniforms and authority, but of a history being recounted, a life he had lived before his world collapsed. What happened? That night? Eli asked. Though he sensed the answer would be difficult to hear, Rodriguez's face darkened. Intelligence indicated a major distribution operation working out of an abandoned textile factory in Harrisburg. The kind of operation that floods communities with drugs, destroys families, turns neighborhoods into war zones. Murphy and Valor were part of a coordinated strike team. The intel was solid, Chen continued, or so we thought. Multiple agencies were involved, state police, DEA, local units. But someone had compromised the operation. The dealers were ready for us. The weight of what followed hung in the morning air like fog. Rodriguez continued, his voice heavy with memory and regret. Murphy and Valor were assigned to clear the building's east entrance. They'd done it hundreds of times before. Smooth, professional, flawless teamwork. But this time, someone was waiting with an automatic weapon. Eli felt his stomach tighten as the reality of what these officers faced in their daily work became clear. His own life, centered around crops and livestock and the gentle rhythms of seasons, seemed almost impossibly peaceful by comparison. Murphy was hit in the first exchange of gunfire, Chen said quietly. Valor stayed with him, trying to protect him, even as the building erupted in chaos around them. We found evidence later that suggested Valor actually dragged Murphy toward cover, trying to get him to safety. The image this created of a loyal animal desperately trying to save his fallen partner was almost too painful for Eli to contemplate. He looked down at Valor, who had pressed closer to his legs, as if sensing the emotional weight of the conversation. In the confusion that followed, with officers down and suspects fleeing in all directions, Valor just vanished, Rodriguez continued. We searched the entire building, the surrounding area, followed up on every lead. For weeks, we had volunteers combing the countryside, checking every animal shelter, every veterinary clinic within a 100-mile radius. The assumption was that he'd been killed in the firefight, Chen added. It was the only explanation that made sense. Valor would never have abandoned Murphy willingly, would never have left the scene unless something catastrophic had happened. Now Eli began to understand the depth of trauma that had brought Valor to his farm. The dog hadn't simply lost a partner. He had witnessed the violent death of someone he loved, had been powerless to prevent it despite his training and dedication. The wounds Eli had treated were nothing compared to the psychological damage that came from such profound loss and perceived failure. The department mourned them both, Rodriguez said. Murphy's funeral was attended by officers from 5 states. We created a memorial wall with both their names, their photographs together. As far as we knew, 2 heroes had died that night, which is why finding him alive, healed, clearly well cared for, it's like getting back a piece of Murphy, a piece of what we lost, Chen explained. You've given us something we thought was gone forever, Mr. Zook. Eli understood their gratitude, but he also understood what it meant for Valor. The dog had found peace on the farm, had learned to trust again, had discovered that life could exist without the constant threat of violence and loss. To return him to the world that had taken everything from him seemed like a special kind of cruelty. What happens now? Eli asked, though he dreaded the answer. Valor needs to be evaluated by our veterinary specialists, Chen said. Both physically and psychologically. If he's deemed fit for duty, he could be paired with a new handler and return to active service. And if he's not fit, The pause that followed told Eli everything he needed to know about departmental policies regarding animals who could no longer perform their assigned functions. As they prepared to leave, Valor allowed Rodriguez to attach the official leash and a collar, accepting the transformation with the dignity of a professional returning to duty. But his eyes remained fixed on Eli, and in that gaze, the older man saw a question that cut straight to the heart. After finding peace, why must we return to the world that broke us? The drive away from the farm was the hardest thing Eli had witnessed. Since Martha's funeral procession, Valor's face appeared in the rear window of the police vehicle, watching his safe haven disappear into the distance, and Eli felt something profound shift in his chest. A recognition that some bonds transcend duty and protocol, and that healing, once begun, demands its own completion. Standing alone in his driveway, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of his farm, Eli realized that the story of him and Valor was far from over. Some connections are too deep to be severed by regulations and procedures, and some kinds of love are too strong to be contained within the boundaries that others try to impose. The farm felt emptier than it had since those first dark days after Martha's death. But there was something else present now, a sense of purpose that had been dormant for too long, a recognition that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or authority, but with patience, faith, and an absolute refusal to abandon those who need us most. The silence that followed Valor's departure was different from the solitude Eli had grown accustomed to after Martha's death. That earlier quiet had been the natural emptiness of loss, the way a house settles into new rhythms when a lifelong presence is suddenly absent. This silence felt wrong, incomplete, like a sentence cut off in the middle of its most important word. For 3 days, Eli moved through his familiar routines, with the mechanical precision of duty overriding desire. The cows still needed milking, the fields still required attention, the endless cycle of farm maintenance continued regardless of personal grief. But Samuel Byler, his neighbor and oldest friend, noticed the change immediately. "You're walking like a man carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders," Samuel observed, as they worked together to repair a section of barn roof that had suffered damage in the recent spring storms. Samuel was a man of few words but keen insight, and his weathered face showed genuine concern. Eli paused in his hammering, looking out over the fields where Valor had spent so many peaceful afternoons keeping watch. "I've been thinking about purpose, Samuel, about what we owe to creatures that trust us completely." "The dog," Samuel said simply. It wasn't a question. The entire Amish community had noticed Valor's presence and observed the bond between man and animal with the kind of understanding that comes from people who live close to the land and its creatures. "His name is Valor," Eli said, and speaking the name aloud felt like a prayer. "He's a police dog, Samuel, was a police dog. They've taken him back to determine if he can work again, if he can serve a new partner after watching his first one die." Samuel set down his hammer and turned to face his friend directly. "And you believe he shouldn't have to?" The question struck to the heart of Eli's restlessness. In the 3 months Valor had lived on the farm, the dog had shown no signs of wanting to return to his previous life. He had embraced the peaceful rhythms of agricultural existence, had found joy in simple companionship and the kind of safety that comes from routine, unmarked by violence or danger. "I've been thinking about Martha," Eli said, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "About how after she got sick, the doctors wanted to put her through treatments that would have given her a few more months, but would have made those months filled with pain and struggle." Samuel nodded slowly, understanding where his friends' thoughts were leading. "She chose differently," Eli continued, "chose to spend her remaining time in peace, surrounded by what she loved, doing the things that brought her joy until she no longer could. The doctors couldn't understand it, thought. She was giving up being irresponsible, but you understood. I understood that sometimes the most loving thing is to let someone rest." to let them find peace on their own terms, rather than forcing them to carry burdens they no longer have the strength to bear. The parallel was clear, and Samuel's expression showed that he grasped not just the comparison, but the depth of Eli's concern for Valor. "What do you know about his condition now?" Eli pulled out the business card Officer Chen had left him, along with a phone number for the police department's veterinary services. "They said they would keep me informed, that I was important to his recovery, but it's been 3 days and I've heard nothing." That afternoon, Eli made a decision that felt both natural and revolutionary for a man who had lived his entire life avoiding unnecessary contact with the English world beyond his community. He walked to the phone shanty at the edge of his property, a small building shared by several Amish families for essential communications, and dialed the number Officer Chen had provided. The conversation that followed was brief but illuminating. Dr. Amanda Foster, the veterinary behaviorist evaluating Valor, was professional but clearly concerned about the dog's condition since his return to official custody. "Mr. Zook, I'm going to be direct with you because Officer Chen told me about the bond you formed with this animal," Dr. Foster said. "Valor's physical condition is excellent. Whatever care you provided was exactly what he needed. But psychologically, he's showing signs of severe distress." Eli's grip tightened on the phone receiver. "What kind of distress?" "Anxiety, depression, refusal to engage with handlers or follow basic commands he previously executed flawlessly. He's not eating regularly, barely sleeps, and shows heightened stress responses to stimuli that wouldn't have affected him before. In clinical terms, we're looking at what appears to be post-traumatic stress disorder, likely triggered by being returned to an environment that reminds him of his trauma." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. He was healing on the farm. He was peaceful, happy, engaged. "Are you saying that bringing him back has made him worse?" "I'm saying that whatever healing process was taking place in your care has been significantly disrupted by this transition. Valor formed a powerful attachment to you and to the environment where he felt safe. Removing him from that context has essentially re-traumatized him." Eli closed his eyes, seeing again Valor's trusting face in the rear window of the police car as it drove away from everything the dog had come to associate with safety and peace. What happens now? That's being debated at the highest levels of the department, Mr. Zook. Lieutenant Hayes, who oversees the K-9 unit, believes that damaged animals have no place in law enforcement, that Valor should be retired immediately and, given his condition, probably euthanized as a humane measure. The word euthanized hung in the air like a death sentence. Eli felt his breath catch, his mind reeling with the implications of bureaucratic efficiency applied to a life he had helped save. "But there are others," Dr. Foster continued, "including Detective Rodriguez and Officer Chen, who believe Valor deserves a chance at rehabilitation. They've seen cases where traumatized service animals have been successfully treated and returned to duty, or at least to productive lives as therapy animals or companions. What would that require? Time, patience, specialized treatment, and most importantly, the involvement of someone Valor trusts completely. In his current state, that person appears to be you, Mr. Zook." The implications of this statement settled over Eli like a mantle of responsibility he had never sought but couldn't ignore. Somewhere in an official facility, Valor was suffering. Not from physical wounds that could be healed with antiseptic and bandages, but from a spiritual injury that required the kind of patience and faith that had been the foundation of Eli's life. "There's a meeting scheduled for next week," Dr. Foster said. "Department officials, legal representatives, insurance evaluators, veterinary experts. They'll be making a final decision about Valor's future. Officer Chen suggested that your input might be valuable, given your unique relationship with the animal." After ending the call, Eli remained in the phone shanty for long minutes, processing what he had learned. The simple act of compassion that had led him to care for an injured animal had evolved into something far more complex, a web of institutional policies, legal considerations, and bureaucratic procedures that threatened to overwhelm the basic human and humane impulse to help a suffering creature. But beneath the complexity, the solution remained as simple as it had been that first morning beneath the oak tree. Valor needed someone who understood that healing takes time, that trust once broken requires infinite patience to rebuild, and that sometimes the most important service is simply offering a safe place where wounds, visible and invisible, can slowly mend. Walking back to his farmhouse as evening painted the Pennsylvania sky in shades of gold and purple, Eli found himself thinking not about policies and procedures, but about the simple truth that had guided his relationship with Martha during her final illness, his care of the farm after her death, and his approach to every meaningful decision in his 61 years of life. Some commitments transcend convenience. Some bonds, once formed, create obligations that have nothing to do with law or regulation and everything to do with the fundamental recognition that we are responsible for those who trust us completely. Valor had chosen to heal on Eli's farm, had chosen to trust again in the shelter of Eli's patient care. That choice, Eli now understood, had created a covenant that couldn't be dissolved by official procedures or institutional needs. The meeting Dr. Foster had mentioned would determine Valor's fate according to the logic of bureaucracy and efficiency. But Eli was beginning to suspect that the most important decisions, the ones that truly matter for the souls involved, would be made not in conference rooms, but in the quiet spaces where hearts recognize their deepest obligations and decide whether to honor them or turn away. Standing on his porch, looking out over fields where Valor had found peace, Eli made a quiet decision that would soon draw him into a world he had never imagined entering, a world of courtrooms and legal arguments, media attention and public scrutiny. But at its center would remain the simple truth that had brought him to this moment. Sometimes love requires us to step beyond our comfort, beyond our familiar boundaries, to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. The night settled over. Lancaster County with its familiar sounds, the lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through cornstalks, the distant call of owls beginning their nocturnal hunt. But for Eli Zook, sleep would not come easily. Tomorrow would begin a journey that would test everything he believed about duty, compassion, and the lengths to which a man should go to honor the trust placed in him by a creature who had no voice. In the decisions being made about his future, the Pennsylvania State Police headquarters in Harrisburg was a world away from the gentle rhythms of Lancaster County, both in distance and in spirit. Eli had never imagined he would find himself walking through its corridors, past bulletin boards covered with wanted posters and departmental notices, surrounded by the controlled chaos of law enforcement operations that never truly ceased. Officer Jen met him at the main entrance, her expression a mixture of professional courtesy and genuine warmth. "Mr. Zook, thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy for you." The meeting room was filled with people whose lives revolved around policies, procedures, and the kind of systematic decision-making that reduced complex situations to manageable categories. Lieutenant James Hayes, a stern man in his 50s whose bearing suggested decades of military and police service, sat at the head of a polished conference table. Beside him, a woman in an expensive suit shuffled through legal documents, the department's insurance representative, Eli learned, whose primary concern was limiting liability in cases involving damaged or unpredictable animals. Dr. Amanda Foster sat across from them, a stack of veterinary reports and behavioral assessments spread before her like evidence in a trial. Detective Rodriguez occupied a chair near the window, his weathered face showing the strain of the past week's developments. And at the far end of the table, almost as if he were trying to remain invisible, sat a young man in civilian clothes, who introduced himself as David Murphy, Detective James Murphy's son. "Gentlemen, Ms. Richardson, Lieutenant Hayes began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions without sentiment. "We're here to determine the disposition of K9 Officer Valor. The facts are straightforward. We have a previously valuable asset who suffered trauma during the line of duty and whose current psychological state makes him unsuitable for continued service." Eli listened as the discussion proceeded in the clinical language of institutional efficiency. Valor was referred to as an asset, his trauma described as operational damage, his future discussed in terms of cost-benefit analysis and departmental liability. The dog who had found peace in Eli's barn, who had learned to trust again, through patient mornings and quiet companionship, was being reduced to a series of calculations and risk assessments. "The veterinary evaluation is clear," the insurance representative, Ms. Richardson, said, consulting her documents. "The animal shows signs of severe psychological distress, aggression toward handlers, and unpredictable responses to stimuli. From a liability standpoint, returning him to active duty would expose the department to significant legal risk." Dr. Foster leaned forward, her professional demeanor barely concealing her frustration. "With respect, Ms. Richardson, what we're seeing isn't inherent aggression, it's trauma response. Valor's behavior has deteriorated specifically because he's been separated from the environment and person he associates with safety and healing. Which brings us to Mr. Zook," Lieutenant Hayes said, turning his attention to Eli for the first time since the meeting began. "I understand you formed some kind of attachment to this animal during the time he was missing." The phrase, "some kind of attachment," felt inadequate to describe the bond that had developed over months of shared mornings, quiet companionship, and mutual healing. But Eli had learned during his years of marriage to Martha that sometimes the deepest truths couldn't be explained to those who hadn't experienced them. "Valor came to my farm injured and afraid," Eli said simply. "I helped him heal. In doing so, we became friends." "Friends," Hayes repeated, and there was something dismissive in his tone that suggested he viewed such sentimentality as irrelevant to the practical decisions at hand. "Mr. Zook, with all due respect to your good intentions, police dogs aren't pets. They're highly trained professionals with specific functions. When they can no longer perform those functions, difficult decisions must be made." David Murphy had remained silent throughout most of the discussion, but now he spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss. "Lieutenant Hayes, with respect, Valor isn't just any police dog. He was my father's partner. For 5 years, they saved lives together, protected communities together. My father died trying to do his job, and Valor was there with him. Doesn't that service, that loyalty, earn him the right to a chance at healing?" The room fell silent at the young man's words. Detective Rodriguez nodded slowly, his own memories of Murphy and Valor's partnership clearly visible in his expression. "I understand the emotional attachment," Hayes said, though his tone suggested he viewed emotion as a complication rather than a relevant factor. "But we can't operate this department based on sentiment. We have budgets, training costs, liability, issues and operational requirements that must be considered." Dr. Foster opened one of her files and pulled out a photograph. "Lieutenant, I'd like you to look at this." She slid the image across the table. It showed Valor during his evaluation period, cowering in the corner of his kennel, eyes wide with fear and stress. "This was taken 3 days ago, and now look at this." She produced a second photograph, clearly taken with a phone camera. It showed Valor on Eli's farm, alert and confident, sitting beside the older man as they watched the sunrise over the Pennsylvania countryside. The contrast was stark. The same animal, but in one image broken and traumatized, in the other peaceful and whole. "The difference isn't just environmental," Dr. Foster continued. "It's relational. Valor has formed a bond with Mr. Zook that represents his pathway back to psychological health. Severing that bond isn't just cruel. It's counterproductive if our goal is to salvage a valuable asset. Ms. Richardson consulted her papers again. Dr. Foster, what exactly are you proposing? That the department maintain this animal indefinitely while he receives therapy. The costs alone. I'm proposing that we explore alternative solutions, Dr. Foster interrupted. Rehabilitation programs, therapy animal training, community service roles that utilize Valor's skills without the high-stress environment of active, a duty. And who would oversee such a program? Hayes asked. Who would be responsible for this animal's care and training? The question hung in the air, and Eli felt the weight of everyone's attention settling on him. He thought of Valor, probably confined in some sterile kennel at that very moment, wondering why the peace he had found had been taken away. He thought of Martha and the courage she had shown in her final months when difficult decisions couldn't be avoided. I would, Eli said quietly. If it would help Valor, if it would give him a chance to heal properly, I would take responsibility for his care. The offer was met with a moment of stunned silence. Lieutenant Hayes was the first to respond. Mr. Zook, you're talking about a significant commitment. Police dogs require specialized care, ongoing training, medical attention that goes beyond what a civilian can provide. Then teach me, Eli said, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. If Valor needs specialized care, show me how to provide it. If he needs ongoing training, show me what he needs to learn. I've spent 40 years caring for animals, learning their needs, helping them when they're hurt or afraid. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression showing genuine respect for Eli's offer. Mr. Zook, what you're suggesting, it would mean working with our veterinarians, our training staff, learning protocols and procedures that most civilians never see. It would mean, David Murphy added softly, giving a hero a chance to find peace after service, the way we hope someone would do for us if we were in his position. The meeting concluded without resolution, but with an agreement to explore the possibilities Dr. Foster and Eli had raised. As the various officials gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Hayes approached Eli directly. Mr. Zook, I want to be clear about something. If we pursue this rehabilitation approach, if we allow you to take custody of a police animal, you would be entering into a legal agreement with significant responsibilities and potential liabilities. This isn't a matter of taking in a stray dog. Eli met the lieutenant's gaze steadily. Lieutenant Hayes, I understand the seriousness of what I'm proposing, but I also understand that Valor trusted me once before, when he was broken and afraid, and that trust led to healing. Maybe it's time to find out if that kind of trust can work again in a different way for a different kind of service. As Eli left the police headquarters and drove back toward the familiar landscape of Lancaster County, he carried with him the weight of a commitment that would change both his life and Valor's in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The simple act of compassion that had begun beneath an oak tree was evolving into something far more complex, but at its heart remained the same fundamental truth that had guided Eli's entire life. When someone trusts you completely, you do whatever it takes to prove worthy of that trust. The experimental rehabilitation program that emerged from that meeting was unlike anything the Pennsylvania State Police had attempted before. Dr. Foster had spent weeks researching similar programs in other states, consulting with experts in animal psychology and developing protocols that would satisfy both the department's operational requirements and Valor's therapeutic needs. The sessions took place at the Peaceful Valley Community Center, a neutral location that carried none of the institutional weight of police headquarters or the protective isolation of Eli's farm. 3 times a week, Eli would make the 20-minute drive from his farm, carrying with him the simple tools that had always defined his approach to working with animals: patience, consistency, and an absolute commitment to earning trust rather than demanding compliance. Dr. Foster observed these sessions with the careful attention of a scientist documenting a groundbreaking experiment, But even her clinical eye couldn't miss the profound difference in Valor's demeanor when Eli entered the room. The traumatized, withdrawn animal, who had barely responded to professional handlers, would lift his head at the sound of Eli's voice, would move toward him with the tentative hope of someone recognizing safety after a long period in danger. "It's remarkable," Dr. Foster murmured during one particularly successful session, watching as Valor calmly accepted the presence of Detective Rodriguez while remaining focused on Eli's gentle commands. "His stress indicators dropped by 60% within minutes of your arrival. The process was slow, measured in small victories rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Some days, Valor would respond well to the gradual reintroduction of police equipment, a radio, a uniform shirt, the kind of gear that had once been as familiar to him as his own breathing. Other days, the sight of anything connected to his former life would send him into the corner, trembling with memories that no amount of gentle coaxing could overcome. But Eli had learned patience during his years of farming, had understood long before he met Valor that healing operates on its own timeline, indifferent to human desires for quick solutions. When Valor retreated into fear, Eli would simply sit nearby, sometimes reading aloud from his worn Bible, sometimes humming the old hymns Martha had loved, always present but never demanding more than the dog could give. Detective Rodriguez became a regular presence at these sessions, his own healing intertwined with Valor's recovery. The loss of his colleague and friend, James Murphy, had left wounds in Rodriguez that mirrors in some ways what Valor had experienced. The sudden, violent disruption of a partnership that had defined his professional identity. "You know," Rodriguez said during one afternoon session, watching Valor successfully navigate an obstacle course that incorporated elements of police training, "Jimmy used to say that Valor could read his mind. They'd work a search scene, and the dog would know what Jimmy was thinking before Jimmy knew it himself." Eli watched Valor's ears prick up at the mention of his former partner's name, not with the panic that had characterized his early reactions, but with something approaching peaceful recognition. "Tell me about Detective Murphy. Help me understand what kind of man Valor lost." The stories that followed painted a picture of a police officer who embodied the best aspects of law enforcement: courage tempered by compassion, authority exercised with wisdom, a commitment to justice that never lost sight of the humanity in even the most difficult situations. Murphy had volunteered at youth centers, had been known to buy groceries for families affected by his arrests of breadwinning fathers, had approached his work with the kind of integrity that inspired respect from colleagues and community members alike. He treated Valor as a full partner, Rodriguez explained, never just as a tool or a resource, but as someone with feelings, preferences, needs beyond just the job. Jimmy would bring special treats, would make sure Valor got time to play, would even take him on off-duty walks just because he knew the dog enjoyed exploring new places. As the weeks passed, word of the unusual rehabilitation program began to spread through the law enforcement community and beyond. Local media picked up the story of an Amish farmer working to heal a traumatized police dog, and suddenly Eli found himself at the center of attention he had never sought, and didn't entirely welcome. The coverage brought both support and criticism. Letters arrived at his farm from people across the country who had been touched by the story of healing and second chances. But there were also voices questioning whether taxpayer money should be spent on therapy for a damaged animal, whether an Amish civilian could possibly understand the complexities of police work, whether sentiment was being allowed to override practical decision-making. Within his own Amish community, reactions were mixed. Some members admired Eli's commitment to helping a suffering creature, seeing in it the kind of compassion their faith demanded. Others worried that his increasing involvement with the English world of police departments and legal procedures represented a dangerous departure from the simple, separate life their community had always maintained. Samuel Byler, ever the voice of practical wisdom, visited Eli one evening as he prepared for another session at the community center. "The whole county's talking about you and this dog," Samuel observed, settling into his familiar chair on Eli's porch. "I never wanted the attention," Eli said honestly. "I just wanted to help Valor heal. And has he? Healed?" Eli considered the question carefully. In many ways, Valor had made remarkable progress. He could now work calmly with Detective Rodriguez, could follow basic commands even in the presence of other officers, had regained much of the confidence and intelligence that had made him such an effective police dog. But there were still triggers. Sudden loud noises, the sight of certain types of weapons, anything that too closely resembled the chaos of that fatal night in Harrisburg. "He's healing," Eli said finally, "but healing isn't the same as returning to what was before. Valor will always carry the memory of what happened to Detective Murphy. The question is whether he can learn to carry that memory without being destroyed by it." The parallel to his own grief over Martha's death wasn't lost on either man. Samuel nodded slowly, understanding the deeper currents running beneath Eli's commitment to Valor's recovery. "And what about you?" Samuel asked. "This work you're doing, it's changing you, bringing you into a world our people have always stayed separate from." It was true. The rehabilitation sessions, the meetings with police officials, the media attention, all of it represented a dramatic departure from the quiet, insular life Eli had always known. But as he reflected on the changes, he realized they didn't feel like departures so much as expansions, ways of living out his faith and values in contexts he had never previously considered. "I think," Eli said slowly, "that sometimes healing requires us to step beyond the boundaries we've always accepted. Valor needed someone willing to enter his world, to understand his pain, to meet him where he was, rather than expecting him to return to where he had been." As the evening settled over Lancaster County, both men sat in comfortable silence, watching the familiar rhythms of rural life continue around them. But beneath the surface calm, both understood that the story of Eli and Valor was approaching a crucial juncture, a point where all the careful rehabilitation work would be tested against the institutional pressures and legal requirements that still threatened to separate them permanently. The experimental program had shown that healing was possible, that trauma could be addressed with patience and compassion rather than simply discarded as an operational inconvenience. But whether that healing would be recognized as sufficient, whether the bond between man and dog would be allowed to continue, remained to be determined by forces beyond their control. Tomorrow would bring another session, another small step in Valor's journey back to wholeness. But increasingly, Eli sensed that their time together in this experimental space was drawing to a close, that soon they would face a more definitive test of everything they had built together. A test that would determine not just Valor's future, but the broader question of how society treats those who have given their service and suffered for it. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September, as autumn was painting the Pennsylvania countryside in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Eli of Martha's favorite quilting patterns. He was in the barn, checking on a cow that had seemed listless the previous evening, when Samuel appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man carrying news that would change everything. "There's a call for you at the phone shanty," Samuel said, his voice carefully neutral. "Police business." Detective Rodriguez's voice, when Eli reached him, carried an excitement that was barely contained by professional protocol. "Mr. Zook, we need you to come to headquarters immediately. Something has happened, something that changes everything we thought we knew about that night." The drive to Harrisburg seemed longer than usual, though Eli couldn't tell if that was because of anticipation or dread. In the months since the rehabilitation program had begun, he had grown accustomed to the rhythm of incremental progress, small victories measured in Valor's improved responses and gradual return to confidence. But Rodriguez's tone suggested something. Far more dramatic was unfolding. The conference room at police headquarters buzzed with an energy Eli had never felt there before. Lieutenant Hayes paced near the windows, his usually stern demeanor replaced by something approaching amazement. Dr. Foster sat at the conference table, her scientific composure barely containing obvious excitement, and in the corner, David Murphy stood beside a television monitor, his young face showing the complex emotions of someone about to witness his father's final moments. "Mr. Zook," Lieutenant Hayes began without preamble, "what I'm about to show you will be difficult to watch, but it changes everything we thought we knew about Detective Murphy's death and Valor's actions that night. The story that emerged was one of those coincidences that seem too convenient for fiction, but occasionally define the turning points of real lives. A demolition crew working to tear down the abandoned textile factory where the fatal raid had occurred had discovered something that investigators had missed in their original sweep of the building. A hidden security camera system, its recorder, tucked into a cavity in the basement wall, protected by concrete and steel that had shielded it from both the gunfire and the subsequent investigations. The system was installed illegally by the drug dealers, Rodriguez explained, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. They wanted to monitor law enforcement activity around the building. The irony is that their paranoia about police surveillance ended up recording something that completely changes our understanding of what happened. Hayes gestured toward the monitor. "Mr. Zook, I want to prepare you for what you're about to see. This footage shows Detective Murphy's final moments and Valor's actions during and after the shooting. It's not easy to watch, but it reveals a level of courage and loyalty that goes beyond anything we had imagined." The security footage was grainy, shot from a high angle that captured most of the building's eastern entrance, where Murphy and Valor had been assigned to establish a perimeter. At first, the images were routine, two figures, one human and one canine, moving with the practiced coordination of partners who had worked together for years. Then, the world exploded into chaos. The gunfire, when it came, was sudden and overwhelming. Multiple automatic weapons opened fire from concealed positions, turning what should have been a controlled police operation into a war zone. Eli watched in horror as Detective Murphy was struck by the initial volley, his body crumpling to the concrete floor of the warehouse entrance. But what followed challenged everything the department had assumed about Valor's behavior that night. Instead of fleeing in panic, as the investigators had theorized, Valor immediately moved to Murphy's side. The dog's behavior was that of a trained professional responding to a crisis, not a frightened animal abandoning his post. Even as gunfire continued around them, Valor positioned himself between Murphy and the shooters, using his own body as a shield. "Watch this part carefully," Rodriguez said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what we never knew happened." On the grainy footage, Valor could be seen grabbing Murphy's tactical vest with his teeth, attempting to drag his wounded partner toward cover behind a concrete pillar. The dog's efforts were methodical, determined, showing no regard for his own safety as bullets sparked off the concrete around them. But the most remarkable moment came when additional gunmen appeared, advancing toward Murphy's position. Valor, still guarding his fallen partner, turned to face the threat directly. What followed was a display of courage that left the room in stunned silence. The dog attacked, not wildly or randomly, but with the precision of his training and the desperation of absolute loyalty. Valor launched himself at the lead gunman, his attack so sudden and effective that it disrupted the entire assault, giving other officers time to respond and potentially saving Murphy's life during those crucial moments. The attack cost Valor dearly. The security footage showed him being struck by gunfire, wounded but not stopped, continuing to fight until the gunmen were forced to retreat. Only then, with his partner still and the immediate threat neutralized, did Valor finally collapse. Beside Murphy, both of them bleeding on the cold concrete. The rest of the footage shows Valor staying with Murphy for another 47 minutes, Dr. Foster said, her professional composure unable to mask her emotion. Even wounded, even in pain, he never left his partner's side. He was still there when the paramedics arrived, still trying to protect Murphy from anyone who approached. The implications of this revelation struck Eli like a physical blow. Everything the department had assumed about that night, that Valor had fled in panic, that he had abandoned his post, that his disappearance represented some kind of failure, was wrong. The dog hadn't run away from the scene. He had been forced away by his own injuries and the chaos that followed, probably crawling and stumbling through 60 miles of Pennsylvania countryside before finally collapsing, broken and bleeding, beneath the oak tree on Eli's farm. David Murphy spoke for the first time since the footage had ended, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't abandon my father. He fought for him. He stayed with him. He did everything any partner could have done. Lieutenant Hayes, who had built his career on institutional efficiency and practical decision-making, found himself facing a truth that demolished his assumptions about damaged animals and their value to the department. "This footage changes everything," he said finally. "Valor didn't suffer trauma because he failed in his duty. He suffered trauma because he succeeded so completely, because he gave everything he had, and it still wasn't enough to save his partner." The room fell silent as the full weight of this discovery settled over everyone present. Valor wasn't a damaged asset whose usefulness had ended. He was a hero whose service had gone unrecognized, whose trauma was the direct result of courage beyond the call of duty. "There's something else," Rodriguez said, pulling out additional documents. "The ballistics report from that night, cross-referenced with this new footage. The gunmen Valor attacked. One of them was carrying the weapon that killed Detective Murphy. If Valor hadn't intervened when he did, if he hadn't disrupted their advance, they might have executed Murphy at close range instead of just wounding him." Dr. Foster leaned forward, her scientific training evident in how she processed this new information. "This also explains Valor's specific trauma responses. He wasn't traumatized by cowardice or failure. He was traumatized by helplessness. He did everything right, fought as hard as any creature could fight, and his partner still died. That kind of psychological injury is fundamentally different from what we've been treating." The implications for Valor's future were immediate and profound. A dog who had fled in panic might be written off as unsuitable for continued service, but a dog who had shown such extraordinary courage, who had literally laid down his life in defense of his partner, deserved something entirely different. "Mr. Zook," Lieutenant Hayes said, his authoritative demeanor replaced by something approaching humility, "I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you gratitude. You didn't just save Valor's life that day you found him beneath your oak tree. You saved the life of a genuine hero whose service had gone unrecognized." As Eli drove home that evening, his mind reeling from what he had learned, he found himself thinking not about the dramatic implications of the security footage, but about the quiet mornings he and Valor had shared on the farm. The dog, who had sat beside him in peaceful companionship, who had learned to trust again through patient days and gentle care, had been carrying the weight of that terrible night alone. But now the truth was known. Valor's trauma wasn't the result of failure, but of extraordinary success, achieved at terrible personal cost. The healing that had taken place on Eli's farm wasn't just recovery from injury. It was the slow, careful repair of a spirit that had given everything for duty and love, and had been broken not by cowardice, but by the kind of courage that most could never imagine. The story of Eli and Valor was entering its final chapter, but now it would be written with the full knowledge of what both man and dog had endured, and what they had given each other during their months of shared healing in the quiet sanctuary of a Pennsylvania farm. The discovery of the security footage transformed everything, but not in the simple, straightforward way that Eli had hoped. Within days of the revelation, what had been a quiet administrative decision about one traumatized police dog became a media sensation that drew attention from across the country. The story had everything that captured public imagination. A heroic animal, a fallen officer, an Amish farmer whose simple compassion had saved a life that others had written off as damaged beyond repair. Television news crews appeared at the end of Eli's lane, their bright lights and intrusive cameras creating exactly the kind of worldly attention that his community had spent generations avoiding. "Hero dog secret revealed," proclaimed the headlines. "Amish angel saves police K9. The truth about Valor's last stand." The coverage was uniformly positive, but Eli found the attention overwhelming and deeply uncomfortable. He had never sought recognition for helping Valor. He had simply done what his faith and conscience demanded when confronted with a suffering creature. More troubling were the complications the publicity created for what should have been a straightforward resolution. The security footage had proven Valor's heroism beyond question, but it had also raised legal and political questions that went far beyond the simple matter of one dog's future. Insurance companies that had been eager to limit their exposure now faced potential lawsuits from Detective Murphy's family, who argued that the department's failure to properly investigate the shooting had denied them benefits they deserved. Politicians seized on the story as an example of either government efficiency or government incompetence, depending on their particular agenda. Animal rights organizations arrived to protest what they saw as the systemic mistreatment of service animals. In the middle of this storm sat Judge Patricia Williams, who had been assigned to preside over the formal hearing that would determine Valor's legal status. The hearing had been necessitated by the insurance company's demand for official resolution of his case, but what had begun as a routine administrative procedure had evolved into something approaching a trial. Dr. Foster had spent weeks preparing comprehensive reports that documented not just Valor's current psychological state, but the remarkable progress he had made during his rehabilitation with Eli. Her clinical language struggled to capture the profound transformation she had witnessed, but the statistics were compelling. Stress indicators reduced by 70%, successful completion of modified training protocols, positive social interactions with both familiar and unfamiliar humans. Detective Rodriguez had volunteered to testify about Valor's past service record and the partnership he had maintained with Detective Murphy. The testimony would be difficult for him personally, but he felt an obligation to ensure that Valor's heroism was properly recognized and that Murphy's sacrifice was honored in the decision about his partner's future. David Murphy had also requested permission to speak at the hearing, though his legal standing in the matter was questionable. His father's death had left him with complex feelings about the department, about Valor, and about the night that had changed everything. The security footage had provided answers to questions that had haunted him for months, but it had also raised new questions about what justice looked like when heroes carried trauma that others couldn't see. The insurance company's position remained unchanged despite the new evidence. Ms. Richardson argued that regardless of Valor's past heroism, his current psychological state made him a liability that the department couldn't afford to maintain. Her legal briefs cited precedent cases, actuarial tables, and risk assessments that reduced the complexities of trauma and healing to statistical probabilities. Lieutenant Hayes found himself in the uncomfortable position of representing a department whose assumptions had been proven wrong. The security footage had forced him to acknowledge that his initial assessment of Valor as a damaged asset had been both inaccurate and unjust. But admitting error in such a public forum carried professional risks that went beyond this single case. For Eli, the approaching hearing represented something far more personal than legal procedure. In the months since Valor had arrived at his farm, the dog had become more than a companion. He had become a bridge between Eli's grief over Martha's death and his gradual return to purposeful living. The rehabilitation work had given Eli a sense of mission that he hadn't felt since his wife's passing, a way of using his gifts for patience and compassion in service of something larger than his own sorrow. The night before the hearing, Eli made a final visit to see Valor at the temporary facility where he was being housed during the legal proceedings. The dog's condition had deteriorated somewhat in the institutional environment, despite the staff's best efforts to accommodate his needs. Being separated from the farm and from Eli's daily presence had triggered some of the anxiety responses they had worked so hard to overcome. "Tomorrow will be difficult for both of us," Eli said softly, his weathered hands gentle as they stroked Valor's coat. "There will be many people, formal procedures, language that doesn't always capture the truth of what we've shared together." Valor pressed against Eli's legs, seeking the kind of comfort that had become as natural as breathing during their months together. The dog's brown eyes, still intelligent despite the trauma they carried, seemed to understand that something significant was about to unfold. "I want you to know," Eli continued, his voice carrying the weight of a promise, "that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever these people decide about your future, you are not alone. You have value that goes beyond any job, any service, any function that others might assign to you." The words were as much for himself as for Valor. Eli had spent his entire life in a community that valued service above recognition, duty above personal advancement, quiet faithfulness above public acclaim. The approaching hearing would test those values against a legal system that operated according to different principles. Samuel Byler had offered to attend the hearing as moral. Judge Patricia Williams had presided over hundreds of hearings during her 15 years on the bench, but few had carried the emotional weight and public attention of this case. As she called the court to order following the recess, she was acutely aware that her decision would resonate far beyond the legal question of one animal's status. "Mr. Zook," she said, her voice carrying the formal authority of judicial procedure, but tempered with evident respect for the man who had become central to this unusual case. "You are here as the final witness in this matter. Please state your full name for the record." "Eli Zook," he replied simply, his weathered hands resting calmly in his lap despite the magnitude of the moment. The courtroom, packed with reporters, police officers, and members of the public, fell into complete silence. "Mr. Zook, you have been caring for the animal known as Valor for several months now. Based on that experience, do you have an opinion regarding his current condition and capabilities?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple in its wording, but profound in its implications. Eli looked across the courtroom to where Valor sat beside the bailiff, the dog's intelligent brown eyes fixed on him with the kind of complete attention that spoke of trust deeper than mere training. "Your Honor," Eli began, his voice quiet but clear, "before I answer that question, I need to tell you about the morning Valor came to my farm." Judge Williams nodded, recognizing that sometimes the most important truths emerge not from direct answers, but from stories that illuminate larger meanings. "It was early March, still cold, patches of snow on the ground," Eli continued, his words carrying the measured pace of a man accustomed to reflection. "I heard something near my oak tree, a sound that didn't belong. When I found him, he was broken, not just physically, though he was badly wounded. Something deeper was damaged." As Eli spoke, Valor's ears perked up slightly, recognizing the familiar cadence of the voice that had guided him through his darkest months. Several spectators in the gallery noticed the dog's response, the way his attention focused completely on Eli despite all the other stimuli in the crowded courtroom. "I didn't know then that he was a police officer, didn't know about Detective Murphy or the shooting or any of the things we've heard about today," Eli said. "I just knew that here was a creature who had been through something terrible and needed help healing." Lieutenant Hayes, sitting with the department's legal team, found himself leaning forward despite his professional detachment. Something in Eli's tone suggested that this testimony would be different from the clinical presentations and policy discussions that had dominated the proceedings. For 3 months, Valor and I shared our mornings together, Eli continued, his words painting a picture of the quiet routine that had defined their relationship. I would do my chores, and he would keep watch over the farm. Not like a guard dog, like a friend making sure everyone was safe. Dr. Foster, who had documented every aspect of Valor's rehabilitation, recognized that Eli was describing something that couldn't be captured in behavioral assessments or psychological evaluations. The bond between man and animal had transcended the categories of her professional training. The healing wasn't just physical, Eli said, his voice gaining strength as he found his rhythm. Yes, his wounds closed and his strength returned. But something else happened during those quiet mornings. He learned to trust again, learned that not every loud noise meant danger, that not every stranger meant threat. Judge Williams found herself drawn into Eli's narrative, despite her efforts to maintain judicial objectivity. There was something compelling about this plain-spoken, farmer's account that cut through the legal complexity to reveal the human and humane dimensions of the case. But more than that, Eli continued, Valor taught me something about courage. I had always thought courage meant not being afraid, meant facing danger without feeling fear. But watching him heal, seeing how he struggled with memories and sounds and smells that brought back that terrible night, I learned that real courage is being afraid and choosing to trust anyway. The courtroom remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. What had begun as formal attention to legal proceedings had become the deeper quiet of people recognizing profound truth. Valor didn't stop being brave when he got hurt, Eli said, his eyes never leaving the dog who had become the center of this complex legal battle. He didn't stop being valuable when he needed time to heal. If anything, what he went through that night, the way he fought for Detective Murphy even when it cost him everything, that made him more precious, not less. Ms. Richardson, the insurance representative who had built her case on actuarial tables and risk assessments, found herself struggling to maintain her professional detachment. Eli's words were challenging the fundamental assumptions that had guided her approach to this case. Your Honor, Eli continued, you've heard testimony today about procedures and policies, about efficiency and liability, but what I've learned from Valor is that some things can't be measured that way. Some bonds are too deep to be reduced to statistics. Some kinds of service go beyond job descriptions. As Eli paused, gathering his thoughts for what would be the most crucial part of his testimony, Valor rose from his position beside the bailiff and took a step toward the witness stand. The movement was subtle, barely noticeable to most observers, but it carried profound meaning for those who understood the language of trust and loyalty. Judge Williams noticed the dog's movement and recognized its significance. In a courtroom filled with legal arguments and expert testimony, the simplest truth was being demonstrated by an animal whose actions spoke louder than any words about the bond that had brought them all together. The moment when Valor moved toward Eli created a shift in the courtroom's energy that was almost palpable. Judge Williams, recognizing that something significant was unfolding, made a decision that departed from standard procedure. Bailiff, she said quietly, please allow the animal to approach the witness stand. What followed would be remembered by everyone present as the most extraordinary moment in their legal experience. Valor walked slowly but deliberately across the courtroom, his movements carrying the dignity of a professional returning to someone he trusted completely. When he reached Eli, the dog sat calmly beside the witness stand, his presence transforming the formal legal proceeding into something far more profound. Eli looked down at his friend, for that's what Valor had become, despite all the official designations and bureaucratic categories, and felt a peace settle over him that had been absent since the morning the police had arrived at his farm. Your Honor, Eli said, his voice carrying new strength with Valor beside him. "I want to tell you about a conversation I had with this dog during our time together." A murmur ran through the gallery at his words. Miss Richardson half rose from her seat, clearly preparing to object to testimony about alleged conversations with an animal. But Judge Williams raised a hand for silence. "Continue, Mr. Zook." "It was a morning in late April," Eli said, his weathered hand resting gently on Valor's head as he spoke. "I was sitting on my porch, reading from Psalms, the way I do most mornings. Valor was lying beside me, the way he always did. But that morning, he seemed particularly restless, like something was weighing on his spirit. Detective Rodriguez, who had worked with K9 partners for over a decade, found himself leaning forward. He had seen the kind of communication that could develop between a handler and a well-trained dog, but something in Eli's tone suggested this was different. I set down my Bible and I looked at him, really looked at him, and I said, "Friend, you're carrying something heavy today, aren't you?" Eli continued, his voice taking on the gentle cadence he had used during those quiet mornings on the farm. And he looked back at me with those brown eyes, and I swear I could see the weight he was carrying. The courtroom remained absolutely silent. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, drawn into Eli's narrative despite its departure from conventional testimony. So I started talking to him the way I used to talk to my wife Martha when she was struggling with her illness. I told him that sometimes the hardest thing about loving someone is not being able to save them, no matter how hard you try. I told him that courage isn't measured by whether you succeed, but by whether you refuse to stop trying, even when everything seems hopeless. Valor's tail moved slightly at the familiar sound of Eli's voice, the same gentle tone that had guided him through months of healing. I told him about Detective Murphy, Eli continued, addressing his words as much to Valor as to the court, about how he was a good man who loved his work and loved his partner. I told him that Murphy wouldn't want him to carry guilt about what happened that night, wouldn't want his partner to suffer for doing everything right in an impossible situation. Dr. Foster, observing Valor's responses with professional interest, noted that the dog's stress indicators, panting, restlessness, hypervigilance, had all but disappeared as Eli spoke. This was more than the calming effect of a familiar voice. It was the response of a soul recognizing profound understanding. "And you know what happened then?" Eli asked, looking directly at Judge Williams. This remarkable animal, this hero, who had given everything for duty and love. He laid his head on my knee, and for the first time since I'd known him, he truly relaxed. Not the exhaustion of trauma, not the watchful rest of someone expecting danger, but the peace that comes from being understood completely. The implications of Eli's words settled over the courtroom like morning mist over a quiet field. This wasn't just testimony about an animal's rehabilitation. It was a profound statement about what healing truly meant, and what society owed to those who had given their service at such personal cost. "Your Honor," Eli said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "I'm not a lawyer or a veterinarian or an expert in police procedures. I'm just a farmer who has learned something about healing from watching this remarkable soul recover from wounds that went deeper than flesh." He paused, looking down at Valor, who met his gaze with the kind of complete trust that transcends species and speaks to the deepest connections possible between living beings. Valor has served with honor. He has sacrificed everything for duty. He has loved completely and suffered profoundly. The question before this court isn't whether he can return to what he was. The question is whether we have the wisdom to recognize what he has become. As Eli spoke these final words, addressing them as much to Valor as to the assembled court, something extraordinary happened. The dog, who had remained calmly seated throughout the testimony, slowly stood and moved to face the courtroom. His posture was alert but peaceful, confident but not aggressive, the bearing of a professional who had found a new kind of purpose rooted in hard-won wisdom and resilience. In that moment, Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that transcended legal procedure or institutional policy. They were seeing the visible proof of what patience, compassion, and absolute fidelity could accomplish, even in the face of trauma that others had deemed insurmountable. Judge Williams, who had built her career on careful attention to precedent and proper procedure, found herself facing a decision that would require her to choose between institutional efficiency and a deeper understanding of justice, not just for Valor, but for everyone who had ever served beyond the call of duty and paid a price that others couldn't see. Judge Patricia Williams had made hundreds of judicial decisions during her 15 years on the bench, but few had required her to weigh institutional policy against the kind of moral clarity that transcends legal precedent. As she looked out over the packed courtroom, seeing the faces of police officers, reporters, animal rights advocates, and ordinary citizens who had been drawn into this remarkable story, she understood that her ruling would resonate far beyond the immediate question of one dog's future. "This court will take a brief recess to consider the testimony presented," she announced, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who recognized the weight of the moment. During the 20-minute recess, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations as people processed what they had witnessed. Eli remained at the witness stand, his hand resting on Valor's head, both of them seemingly at peace despite the magnitude of the decision pending. When Judge Williams returned, the courtroom fell silent with an anticipation that felt almost sacred. "In the matter of K-9 Officer Valor," she began, her voice clear and strong, "this court has heard extensive testimony regarding the animal's service record, his trauma, his rehabilitation, and his current condition. We have seen evidence of extraordinary courage, profound loss, and remarkable healing." She paused, looking directly at Valor, who sat calmly beside Eli's chair, alert but peaceful. "The law requires this court to balance institutional needs against individual welfare, efficiency against compassion, precedent against the recognition that some cases transcend the categories we typically apply. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, this court makes the following: a ruling." The silence in the room was so complete that the sound of Valor's breathing was audible from the gallery. "K-9 Officer Valor is hereby approved for return to limited service with the Pennsylvania State Police, with the following conditions. First, his service will be restricted to community outreach, therapy work, and educational programs that utilize his training and experience without exposing him to high-stress operational environments." A collective exhale ran through the courtroom, but Judge Williams continued. "Second, Mr. Eli Zook will be designated as Valor's primary care coordinator, with authority to oversee his daily welfare and to make decisions regarding his participation in departmental activities. The state police will provide necessary support and resources, but Mr. Zook's assessment of Valor's well-being will take precedence in all matters affecting the animal's health and happiness." David Murphy, sitting in the front row, felt tears he hadn't expected as he realized that his father's partner would be honored rather than discarded, would be allowed to serve in a way that respected both his capabilities and his limitations. Third, Judge Williams continued, "The Pennsylvania State Police will establish new protocols for the evaluation and support of service animals who experience trauma in the line of duty, recognizing that such animals deserve the same consideration and care that we provide to human officers who suffer similar injuries." Lieutenant Hayes, despite his initial reservations, found himself nodding in recognition of the wisdom in the judge's decision. The security footage had forced him to acknowledge that his assumptions about damaged animals had been both wrong and unjust. Finally, the judge concluded, this court wishes to recognize that the healing demonstrated in this case represents more than successful animal rehabilitation. It represents a profound lesson about the nature of service, sacrifice, and the bonds that transcend institutional boundaries. As the formal proceedings concluded, Valor rose from his position beside Eli, and in a moment that surprised everyone present, walked calmly to the center of the courtroom and sat in the formal attention posture that had been his trademark during his years of active service. But this time, his attention was divided, part professional acknowledgement of the authority that had just recognized his value, part personal recognition of the man who had made his healing possible. 6 months later, the story of Eli and Valor had evolved into something even more remarkable than their dramatic courtroom appearance. Valor's new role with the Pennsylvania State Police took him to schools, community centers, and veterans organizations throughout the state, where his calm presence and remarkable story inspired conversations about healing, resilience, and the various forms that service can take. The protocols Judge Williams had ordered became a model for other law enforcement agencies across the country, leading to the development of comprehensive support programs for service animals who experienced trauma in the line of duty. Dr. Foster published research based on Valor's rehabilitation that influenced veterinary practice nationwide. But perhaps most importantly, the bond between Eli and Valor continued to thrive in its new context. Several days each week, Valor lived on the farm, helping with the simple tasks that had first taught him peace was possible after trauma. The rest of the time, he worked with his new handler, Officer Sarah Chen, visiting schools and community centers where his story inspired others to believe in the possibility of healing after profound loss. On a warm morning in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after Valor had first appeared beneath the oak tree on Eli's farm, the two friends sat together on the familiar porch, watching the sun paint the Pennsylvania countryside in shades of gold and green that Martha would have loved. "You know, boy," Eli said quietly, his weathered hand gentle on Valor's head, "I think we both learned something this year about what it means to serve." Valor's tail thumped once against the porch floor, a sound that had become as familiar and comforting as church bells or the call of morning doves at dawn. "Service isn't just about returning to what we were before," Eli continued, his voice carrying the wisdom that comes from walking through darkness and finding light on the other side. "Sometimes the greatest service comes from using what we've learned in our broken places to help others find their way to healing." The morning settled around them with the kind of peace that comes not from the absence of struggle, but from the knowledge that struggle can be transformed into wisdom, that trauma can become the foundation for deeper compassion, and that the bonds forged in healing are strong enough to change not just individual lives, but the institutions and communities that recognize their value. In courtrooms and conference rooms across the country, policies were changing because two souls had found each other beneath an oak tree and discovered that healing, when it's real, ripples outward in ways that transform everyone it touches. But on this peaceful morning on a Pennsylvania farm, the most important truth was simpler and more profound. Sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in dramatic courtroom scenes or policy changes, but in the quiet moments when healing. Souls recognize that they are no longer alone and that the love they've found is strong enough to carry them through whatever challenges lie ahead.